The studio lights blazed as tension filled the political talk show set. What happened next would leave veteran news anchor Bret Baier speechless and transform Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett into the most talked-about politician of the week. Baier thought he had the perfect trap. He'd spent hours preparing what he believed would be career-ending questions designed to expose what he called Crockett's freshman mistakes. The seasoned journalist, known for his aggressive interview style, was confident he could dismantle the young Texas representative's credibility in front of millions of viewers. But Crockett had come prepared for war. What she pulled out in response didn't just silence Baier. It left the entire panel stunned, the audience gasping, and social media exploding within minutes. The comeback was so devastating that even Baier's own colleagues started questioning his approach. Before we dive into how this first-time Congresswoman destroyed one of television's most experienced political interviewers, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss these explosive political moments, and comment below where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers worldwide. This wasn't just another political interview gone wrong. This was a moment when experience met preparation, when establishment media faced a new generation of politicians who refused to be intimidated. And what Crockett did next would be replayed millions of times across every social platform. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know who these two players really are and what was at stake. Bret Baier had built his career as one of television's most respected political interviewers. With over 2 decades in broadcast journalism, he questioned presidents, destroyed political careers with tough questions, and earned a reputation as someone who never backed down from a fight. His interview style was legendary, methodical, relentless, and designed to expose weaknesses in his subjects' arguments. Baier represented the old guard of political media. He believed in the power of established journalism to hold politicians accountable, especially newer members of Congress who he felt hadn't earned their stripes. His preparation for interviews was meticulous, his research teams legendary, and his ability to catch politicians off guard had made him a feared figure in Washington. On the other side sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a first-time representative from Texas who had quickly gained national attention for her fiery speeches and unwavering progressive stances. A former civil rights attorney with a law degree and years of courtroom experience, Crockett had already proven she wasn't intimidated by powerful opponents. But many in the media still saw her as inexperienced, too young, too outspoken for the serious business of governance. Critics often dismiss her as all flash and no substance, claiming she was better at social media soundbites than actual policy work. The establishment media, including veterans like Baier, seemed determined to prove she was out of her depth. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This interview was happening during a crucial moment in Congress, with major legislation hanging in the balance. Crockett's credibility wasn't just personal. It represented the credibility of a new generation of diverse, progressive lawmakers who were challenging the traditional way Washington operated. If Baier could successfully discredit her on national television, it would send a message to every young politician who dared challenge the establishment. If Crockett could hold her ground against one of media's biggest names, it would prove that the new generation was ready for prime time. The stage was set for a battle between old and new, establishment and insurgent, experience and fresh energy. Neither one knew that this interview would become a defining moment in both their careers. The interview started normally enough, with standard questions about current legislation and Crockett positions on key issues. But viewers could sense the tension building as Baier's questions became increasingly aggressive and personal. Congresswoman Crockett, Baier began, his voice carrying that familiar edge that regular viewers knew meant trouble was coming. You've been in office less than 2 years, and yet you seem to have opinions on everything from foreign policy to economic theory. Don't you think your constituent deserves someone with actual experience making these decisions? The panel, consisting of 2 political analysts and a former congressman, shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't a question about policy. This was a direct attack on Crockett's qualifications to hold office. Crockett maintained her composure, her legal training evident in her measured response. I think my constituents deserve someone who listens to them and fights for their interests, regardless of how long I've been in Washington. Experience means nothing if you're experienced at serving the wrong people. But Baier wasn't finished. He leaned forward, papers shuffling in his hands, the classic setup for what insiders call the document drop, where he would produce research designed to embarrass his target. Let's talk about experience, Baier continued, his tone becoming more aggressive. In your first year alone, you've co-sponsored over 200 bills, many of which had no chance of passing. You've made statements about complex economic issues that economists have called fundamentally flawed. Your own party leadership has had to walk back some of your more extreme comments. Isn't this exactly the kind of inexperience that hurts your district? The atmosphere in the studio grew thick with tension. Camera operators zoomed in on Crockett's face, expecting to catch her looking flustered or defensive. The panel members exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or let this play out. Crockett's response was measured, but viewers could see fire building in her eyes. I'd rather co-sponsor bills that help working families than spend decades co-sponsoring bills that help corporate donors. And I'd rather make statements that challenge conventional wisdom than repeat talking points that maintain a broken status quo. Baier sensed he hadn't landed the knockout blow he was looking for, so he escalated further. This is where many political observers later said he made his crucial mistake. He got personal. Congresswomen, with respect, you're a former attorney who won one election in a heavily Democratic district. You've never run a business, never served in the military, never held executive office. What qualifies you to lecture seasoned lawmakers and policy experts about how government should work? The question hung in the air like a challenge. This wasn't just about policy disagreements anymore. This was about whether Crockett belonged in the same room as Washington's established power players. The camera caught something shifting in Crockett's expression. Where moments before there had been measured responses, now there was something else, the look of someone who had been underestimated one too many times and was about to remind everyone why that was a mistake. One of the panel members, a former congressman who had served for over 20 years, looked visibly uncomfortable with the direction of the questioning. He started to interject, maybe we should focus on specific policy. But Baier cut him off with a wave of his hand. No, I think this is important. The American people need to understand who's making decisions that affect their lives. What happened next would become the most replayed moment of the entire interview. Crockett sat back in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth, the same expression she'd worn in courtrooms when opposing counsel had just made a critical error. Mr. Baier, she began, her voice calm but carrying an undertone that made everyone in the studio pay close attention. I think you're absolutely right. The American people do need to understand who's making decisions that affect their lives. So let's talk about qualifications. The veteran journalist had no idea what was coming next, but something in Crockett's tone should have warned him that his carefully planned attack was about to backfire spectacularly. What came next would be studied in communication classes and replayed on social media for weeks. Crockett didn't just offend herself. She systematically dismantled not just Baier's attack, but the entire premise behind it. You want to talk about qualifications. Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength and confidence. Let's start with yours, Mr. Baier. You've spent your entire career in media, never holding elected office, never having to answer to constituents, never having your decisions directly impact people's daily lives. Yet you sit here questioning my qualifications to represent the people who elected me. The shift in energy was immediate and palpable. Baier's confident posture faltered slightly as he realized the tables were turning. The panel members sat forward, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. But more importantly, Crockett pressed on, let's talk about the qualifications you seem to value. You mentioned business experience. Are we talking about the kind of business experience that shipped jobs overseas? Military service. You mean the kind that got us into decades-long wars that accomplished nothing but enriching defense contractors? Executive experience, like the executives who crashed the economy in 2008. Baier tried to interrupt. Congresswomen, that's not... I'm not finished, Crockett said firmly, her courtroom experience showing as she maintained control of the exchange. You want to know what qualifies me? I spent years representing people who couldn't afford high-powered lawyers. I've seen what happens when government policies fail real families. I've fought against systems designed to keep people powerless. She leaned forward, looking directly into the camera instead of at Baier. And you know what else qualifies me? I'm here representing people who look like me, who grew up where I grew up, who understand struggles that have been ignored by Washington for decades. That's not inexperience. That's exactly the kind of experience Congress has been missing. The studio fell silent. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, unsure whether to keep filming or give everyone a moment to process what they'd just witnessed. But Crockett wasn't done. She turned back to Baier, who was visibly struggling to regain control of his own interview. "You asked about the 200 bills I've co-sponsored. You're right, many won't pass in this Congress. But you know why? Because they address problems that experienced politicians you seem to admire have been ignoring for decades. Housing affordability, student debt relief, healthcare access, climate change. These aren't radical ideas everywhere except Washington." She pulled out her phone, a move that shocked everyone because phones were typically forbidden during interviews. But instead of stopping her, the producers realized they were witnessing television gold. "Since you did your research on me, let me share some research on you," Crockett said, scrolling through her phone with the confidence of someone who had come completely prepared. "In the last 5 years, you had over 200 interviews with elected officials. Want to guess how many of those were with women of color? How many were with representatives from working-class districts? How many actually focus on the issues affecting the people you claim to care about?" Baier's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The veteran interviewer, who had made a career of asking the tough questions, was suddenly the one being questioned, and he had no answers. "The problem isn't my experience, Mr. Baier. The problem is that people like you have spent so long talking to the same types of people that you've forgotten what actual representation looks like." One of the panel members, the former congressman, started to applaud slowly. The gesture seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the studio, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. "Outstanding," the former congressman said, his voice barely audible over the sudden commotion. "That was absolutely outstanding." The other panel members nodded in agreement, while Baier sat in stunned silence, still trying to process how completely his interview had been turned on its head. But Crockett wasn't finished delivering her masterclass in political communication. "You want to know what really qualifies me for this job," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter and commanding attention one final time. "I'm not here to make friends with lobbyists or get invited to the right parties in Washington. I'm here because people in my district are tired of being represented by politicians who care more about their media appearances than their constituents' lives." She stood up, extending her hand to a still speechless Baier. "Thank you for this opportunity to clarify my qualifications. I hope your viewers now understand exactly who's representing them, and who's just performing for cameras." As Crockett shook hands with the panel members, all of whom seemed impressed despite their different political affiliations, Baier finally found his voice. We'll be right back after this commercial break," he stammered, looking directly into the camera for the first time since Crockett's counterattack began. But everyone in the studio knew that what had just happened couldn't be contained by commercial breaks or network scheduling. This moment would have a life of its own. Before the commercial break had even ended, social media was already exploding. The hashtag #CrockettOwnsReality was trending within minutes, with clips of her response being shared thousands of times per minute across every platform. The immediate fallout was unlike anything anyone in the studio had ever experienced. Baier's own network received hundreds of calls from viewers, with reactions split sharply along predictable lines. His supporters claimed Crockett had been disrespectful and unprofessional, while defenders praised her for finally giving the media establishment the reality check it desperately needed. But it wasn't just partisan reactions. Political analysts from across the spectrum were calling it one of the most effective defensive performances they'd ever seen from a first-time politician. A former presidential campaign manager tweeted, "Crockett just gave a masterclass in how to turn defense into offense." Baier never saw it coming. Within hours of the interview airing, Crockett's congressional office reported receiving over 5,000 messages of support from across the country. Her fundraising platform crashed from the volume of small-dollar donations pouring in. Campaign strategists from both parties were already studying the clip, trying to understand how she had so effectively neutralized what should have been a career-damaging attack. The broader implications of this confrontation extended far beyond one interview or even one politician's career. For years, establishment media figures like Baier had operated under the assumption that their experience and institutional authority gave them the upper hand when interviewing younger, less established politicians. Crockett had shattered that assumption completely. She had shown that the new generation of politicians wasn't just different in terms of demographics or policy positions. They were fundamentally different in how they approached political communication. They weren't going to be intimidated by traditional power structures or accept the premise that experience in broken systems was somehow more valuable than fresh perspectives and authentic representation. The interview also highlighted a growing disconnect between traditional political media and the politicians they were trying to cover. Baier's questions reflected assumptions about qualifications and experience that many voters, particularly younger and more diverse voters, simply didn't share. When he attacked Crockett for lacking traditional credentials, he was essentially attacking the very diversity and fresh thinking that many Americans had voted for. Political science professors were already incorporating the interview into their curricula as an example of how political communication was evolving in the social media age. Unlike previous generations of politicians who had to rely on friendly media coverage to get their message out, Crockett had demonstrated that politicians could now bypass traditional gatekeepers entirely and speak directly to their audiences. The impact on Baier's career was immediate and significant. While he retained his position and his core audience, his reputation as an unflappable interviewer had taken a serious hit. Media critics noted that he seemed unprepared for Crockett's counterattack, despite having had access to the same research that should have told him she was a skilled attorney with extensive experience in hostile questioning. More importantly, the interview became a template for other young politicians facing similar attacks. Within weeks, political consultants were advising their clients to study Crockett's performance as an example of how to effectively respond to establishment criticism. The interview also sparked broader conversations about representation in political media. Crockett's question about how many women of color Baier had interviewed forced other media figures to examine their own interview patterns and guest selections. Several major news programs quietly began diversifying their regular guest lists in the weeks following the confrontation. For Crockett herself, the interview transformed her from a promising freshman congresswoman into a national political figure. Speaking requests poured in from across the country, with organizations eager to hear from a politician who had so effectively challenged media assumptions about qualifications and experience. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on political discourse itself. The interview demonstrated that the old model of political communication, where experienced media figures could intimidate or diminish younger politicians through aggressive questioning, was no longer sustainable. Politicians like Crockett had shown they were not only willing to fight back, but capable of winning those fights decisively. The message to both media and political establishments was clear. The new generation of politicians wouldn't be dismissed, diminished, or deterred by traditional power structures. They would meet challenges head-on, armed with their own research, their own perspectives, and their own definitions of what qualified someone to represent the American people. As one political commentator noted in the days following the interview, Baier thought he was conducting a standard takedown interview with an inexperienced politician. Instead, he became the subject of a masterclass in political communication from someone who understood the moment better than he did. The interview continued to generate discussion weeks later, with political communication experts analyzing every aspect of Crockett's response. Her ability to redirect the conversation from her qualifications to Baier's, her use of concrete data to challenge his assumptions, and a direct appeal to viewers over the interviewer's head became textbook examples of effective political communication in the modern era. This wasn't just a politician winning an interview. It was evidence of a fundamental shift in how political power and media authority would operate in the years to come. And based on the overwhelmingly positive response Crockett received from voters, that shift was long overdue. The ripple effect of this confrontation continued to expand far beyond what anyone could have predicted. 3 weeks after the interview aired, major universities were already incorporating the footage into their political science and communications curricula. Professor Maria Santos at Georgetown University told her students that Crockett's performance represented a masterclass in turning perceived weakness into demonstrable strength. What made the interview particularly significant was how it exposed a generational divide not just in politics, but in political communication itself. Traditional media figures like Baier had built their careers on a model where they controlled the narrative flow, where their institutional authority gave them the upper hand in any confrontation with elected officials. This model had worked for decades, creating a clear hierarchy where media figures sat in judgment of politicians. Crockett had shattered that hierarchy completely. By questioning Baier's qualifications to judge hers, she had essentially flipped the power dynamic that had governed political interviews for generations. She wasn't just defending her record. She was challenging the entire system that gave media figures the authority to determine who belonged in political office. The interview sparked intense debate in journalism schools across the country. Some professors argued that Crockett had crossed the line by attacking the interviewer rather than simply answering his questions. They worried that her approach could lead to a breakdown in the traditional relationship between press and politicians, making it harder for journalists to hold elected officials accountable. But other educators saw it differently. Professor James Mitchell at Columbia Journalism School noted that the old model assumed that media authority was inherently legitimate and that politicians should accept that authority without question. Crockett forced us to examine whether that assumption still makes sense in a diverse democracy. The debate wasn't just academic. Working journalists began questioning their own approaches to political interviews, particularly when dealing with politicians from non-traditional backgrounds. Several major news organizations quietly began reviewing their interview preparation processes, recognizing that the old playbook might not be effective with a new generation of politicians who refuse to accept traditional power dynamics. Social media analysis revealed just how dramatically the political landscape was shifting. The original interview clip garnered over 50 million views across all platforms within the first month. But more significantly, the demographic breakdown of viewers showed that younger Americans were consuming political content at unprecedented rates, drawn by politicians like Crockett who spoke their language and challenged establishment assumptions. This engagement translated into real political power. Within 6 months of the interview, Crockett's congressional office reported that her legislative proposals were receiving more co-sponsors than typical for a first-time representative. Her amendment success rate improved dramatically as colleagues who had previously dismissed her began taking her seriously as a political force. The interview also changed how political campaigns approached media training. Traditional media consultants who had built careers teaching politicians to stay on message and avoid confrontation found their services less in demand. Instead, campaigns began hiring trainers who specialized in what they called offensive defense, the ability to turn media attacks into opportunities for countermessaging. Campaign strategist David Chen, who had worked on presidential campaigns for over 2 decades, observed that Crockett showed politicians that they don't have to accept the premises of hostile questions. She demonstrated that with proper preparation and genuine conviction, you can change the entire frame of a conversation. This shift in approach wasn't limited to progressive politicians. Conservative candidates also began studying Crockett's technique, recognizing that her methods could be effective regardless of political ideology. The key wasn't her specific policy positions, but her refusal to be intimidated by traditional authority figures and her ability to redirect conversations toward her strengths. The interview had international implications as well. Political leaders in other countries began incorporating similar techniques when dealing with hostile media. A member of the Canadian Parliament referenced Crockett's performance during a contentious interview, asking her interviewer about his qualifications to judge her policy expertise. A rising political leader in the United Kingdom used similar tactics when questioned about her background, turning the focus back to her interviewer's assumptions about working-class representation. This global influence highlighted how political communication was becoming increasingly interconnected, with successful techniques spreading rapidly across borders through social media and international news coverage. Crockett's confrontation with Baier had become a case study in political communication programs worldwide. The long-term impact on Baier's career proved more complex than initial reaction suggested. While he faced criticism from some quarters, he also gained respect from others who appreciated that he had given Crockett a platform to demonstrate her capabilities. Some media critics argued that by challenging her so directly, he had actually done viewers a service by allowing them to see how she handled pressure. Baier himself seemed to evolve his approach following the interview. In subsequent conversations with other young politicians, he began incorporating more questions about their positive vision for governance rather than focusing solely on their perceived shortcomings. While he maintained his reputation for tough questioning, he appeared more conscious of the assumptions underlying his interview style. The interview also sparked broader conversations about representation in political media. Crockett's pointed question about how many women of color Baier had interviewed forced an uncomfortable reckoning within the industry. Major news organizations began tracking the demographics of their political guests more carefully, recognizing that their interview lineups had significant influence on public perceptions of who belonged in political leadership. This scrutiny led to tangible changes. Several major Sunday morning political shows diversified their regular guest panels, bringing in more voices from different backgrounds and perspectives. While critics argued that some of these changes were merely cosmetic, supporters pointed to the increased visibility of previously marginalized political figures as evidence of meaningful progress. The phenomenon extended beyond traditional media into the world of political fundraising. Crockett's performance had demonstrated the power of authentic political communication to mobilize small-dollar donors. Her congressional campaign committee reported that online donations spiked by over 2,000% in the week following the interview, with contributions coming from all 50 states. This fundraising success caught the attention of political operatives who realized that viral moments could be more valuable than traditional advertising. Campaign strategists began actively seeking opportunities for their candidates to have similar breakthrough moments, though few proved as effective as Crockett's organic response to Baier's questioning. The interview also influenced how political parties approached candidate recruitment and training. Democratic Party officials noted that candidates with legal backgrounds, like Crockett, seemed better equipped to handle hostile media environments. This led to increased recruitment of attorneys, prosecutors, and others with courtroom experience who could effectively counter-argue under pressure. Republican strategists made similar observations, recognizing that their candidates needed better preparation for dealing with younger, more diverse opponents who wouldn't be intimidated by traditional political tactics. This led to changes in debate preparation and media training across both parties. The cultural impact proved equally significant. Crockett's performance became a touchstone for discussions about respect, authority, and representation in American society. Her refusal to accept Baier's premise about qualifications resonated with many Americans who felt that traditional gatekeepers had failed to represent their interests adequately. This cultural resonance extended into corporate America, where diversity and inclusion professionals began using clips from the interview in training sessions. They highlighted how Crockett had challenged assumptions about qualifications and demonstrated the value of different perspectives in leadership roles. Educational institutions also embraced the interview as a teaching tool. High school debate coaches used it to demonstrate effective argumentation techniques. College admissions counselors reference it when helping students from non-traditional backgrounds prepare for interviews. Law schools incorporated it into courses on oral advocacy and cross-examination. The interview's influence on political discourse proved lasting. In the months following the confrontation, political interviews became noticeably more dynamic. Politicians felt empowered to challenge interviewers' assumptions, while journalists adapted their techniques to account for more assertive subjects. This evolution created more engaging political content, though it also made interviews less predictable for both participants and audiences. Perhaps most significantly, the interview demonstrated that political power was shifting in fundamental ways. Traditional gatekeepers could no longer rely solely on institutional authority to control political narratives. Success increasingly depended on authenticity, preparation, and the ability to connect directly with audiences through social media and other digital platforms. This shift had profound implications for American democracy. It suggested that political leadership was becoming more accessible to people from diverse backgrounds who might not have succeeded under previous systems. At the same time, it raised questions about how democratic institutions would adapt to these changes and whether traditional checks and balances would remain effective. The interview between Baier and Crockett ultimately became more than just a memorable television moment. It became a symbol of broader changes in American political culture, representing the ongoing tension between established institutions and emerging voices demanding representation. Whether these changes would strengthen or weaken democratic governance remained an open question, but the interview made clear that there was no returning to the old ways of conducting political discourse. Thanks for watching this incredible political moment unfold and understanding its far-reaching implications for American democracy. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss these explosive confrontations that are reshaping our political landscape. What did you think of Crockett's performance and its lasting impact on political communication? Was she too aggressive with Baier, or exactly what political discourse needed to evolve? How do you think this moment will influence future political interviews? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one and love hearing different perspectives from our viewers around the world. Your engagement helps us understand which political stories matter most to you, and we use your feedback to guide our future content.